Hello and welcome to Extending Functionality in Microsoft Dynamics 365. My name is Derek Borman and I will be your instructor. So there's a lot of courses out there that talk about, basics around how to move through the sales and service functionality, how to go in and do some of your basic customizations and configurations around the application. What we want to do in this course is talk a little bit about kind of that gap in between when you bring a developer in to actually kind of custom develop solutions for your Dynamics 365 implementation versus where you can take advantage of some of the existing functionality that's out there and now start to extend and build upon those solutions to build more customized solutions. It could be, modifying navigation. It could be how you use custom actions. It could be even just using third-party applications like Power Apps and Flow to really bridge through some of the different gaps. And that's really the purpose of this course, is to look at some of the different areas that bridge the gaps between the baseline customization functionality and the actually custom core development functionality. So in this course we're going to look at a few different things, but the first thing we want to really look at is the new app designer. So one of the really cool things around Dynamics 365 is the ability to have more modularized apps for sales functionality, service functionality, operations functionality. As people going in and building solutions, you have the capabilities to leverage the app designer to go in and create kind of your own different module or applications that people can navigate through inside the application. So instead of having a specific modularized app just for field service, maybe you want to do a hybrid scenario that has maybe some field service functionality along with maybe some just standardized customer service functionality. You could do that and bring that in and make that available and limit who would have access to that. We also want to talk just a little bit about using some of the built-in items versus coding. A lot of times people go out and start building plugins and building client-side scripting and using some of those different situations to facilitate how they want to work through the application. There's a lot of options available inside the application with things like custom actions and real-time workflows and even business process flows and business rules that you can leverage to build a lot of the same type of functionality that you could do just by going in and building and creating a plugin. So we want to talk just a little bit about what that process looks like and give you some ideas around where you might utilize some of those specific situations. We also want to talk about some of the new enhancement functionalities. When we start talking about things like Power Apps and the Common Data Service and using things like Microsoft Flow, these are all things that you can leverage as part of your Dynamics 365 implementation to further leverage some of the built-in functionality around workflows and dialogues and be able to trigger processes inside the application. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that relationship looks like, but more specifically the flow piece of the puzzle and how you can use Flow to really start automating processes across the board. We're also going to look at some of the new machine learning and text analytic capabilities that are available as part of Dynamics 365. We're going to show you how to set that information up. We're going to show you how to connect to Azure Analytics Service, how to use some of the different text analytic pieces to do things like case recommendation and product recommendations and really go through and see how that can leverage your analytic piece around the application itself. We're all going to look a little bit at record creation options. And so, Dynamics 365 has the automated record creation capabilities where you can go in and create different types of records in the application based upon things like emails that are coming in or any type of activity that might be coming in from the application. Now, a lot of times those might be generated from, third-party applications. A real common example of that is social engagement. When somebody captures a post inside social engagement, you can consume that information and create a record inside Dynamics 365. We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like from a social engagement perspective, but we're also going to build on that and talk a little bit about how that record creation framework can actually be used to consume and create cases and leads or whatever the item might be from multiple areas coming across the application, whether that's using it from Twitter or some other facilitation method from that standpoint. And then finally, we'll use the last module to really talk about that developing solution situation. Now that we've bridged the gap a little bit based upon here's some of the functionality that's available, what would be the next step? If you can't actually go through and accomplish that based upon what we've done, how could you go ahead and develop your own custom solutions from that standpoint? And that's that's really where we'll end that, is bridging that gap and moving on to maybe the developer course where you might be developing custom solutions. One of the more exciting features of Dynamics 365 is this concept of kind of modularized applications. So instead of having your navigation area where you've got, sales and service and marketing, you're actually going out and you're creating more modularized applications. So you're having an app specifically targeted at sales functionality, or you have an app specifically targeted at service functionality. And when you access that application, now the navigation elements inside the sitemap have been changed or adjusted accordingly to reflect whatever that functionality is around that app. So you have areas that are specifically targeted at sales functionality, and when you click on those individual areas, the items that you're seeing in there are specifically targeted at that specific level of functionality. Now you see that very commonly when you start doing add-on solutions, like if you're doing field service for Dynamics 365, or if you're doing project service automation for Dynamics 365, it automatically creates those different app functionality inside the application that you can leverage to very quickly navigate through different areas. What we want to look at in this particular module is just an overview of what that new business application model or modular-based business applications looks like inside Dynamics 365. But more importantly, we want to explore how you have the capabilities to go out and build your own modular applications. So if you have very specific targeted functionality that maybe doesn't fall under the traditional sales or service or operation, and you want to create almost more hybrid models, how can you go ahead and do that? And what are the options there for controlling what specific objects are available inside those modularized items, as well as even looking at who has access to do or work with those modules. So how you can limit specific access to individual items. And then we'll talk a little bit about not only how to configure those app modules, but some of the things that go along with it, things like the sitemap and how you can use the new sitemap editor to really control what specific information is displayed inside the application. Before we go in and delve into each one of these in a little bit more detail and start talking about them overview-wise, let's just real quick high-level recap kind of what's new. So when we talk about the apps modules and controlling how people navigate through, we're really talking about three components that make up this entire solution. It's the apps modules themselves. So as you can see here, we've got your traditional apps modules where when you click on the Dynamics 365 menu, you'll get kind of your home menu, which will bring you to a home screen that shows all the individual apps that you have access to based upon your Dynamics 365 implementation. And then it brings it into the individualized one. So you have your kind of custom app that has all the different modules that you would be working together by default. Then you have your individual targeted ones, your sales, customer service, field service, project service automation. If you want to go in and start designing those elements and you want to start creating your own apps on the fly, that's where the app designer comes into play. So the app designer allows you to basically create an app from scratch. You can define what the sitemap looks like for that app, so what the individual capabilities are inside that sitemap for the different areas that people can navigate to, as well as the groupings and the individualized sub areas that show up within there. Also talks a little bit about dashboards. So obviously within that app, there's going to be dashboards that will be accessible for people to work with, as well as the different entities and the forms and the views and all those items. So the app designer really lets you build all of those elements. So what forms are people going to use to access the specific entities that are available? What specific items are they going to use from a dashboard perspective to move around within the application? And then the final piece to that is the sitemap designer. So within the app module designer, there is a sitemap designer that allows you to, for that specific app, define how people are going to navigate through the sitemap. So it's really a three-tier process that you're going to see as you're moving forward. So the whole concept behind this is allowing you to really go out and build items based upon tasks that you need to accomplish from your organization. So what you really do is you go in and you look at all the different solution assets that might make up that app module. So when we say solution assets, we're talking about what you would typically see inside of a Dynamics 365 solution. If you're going to add the account entity to your app, that account entity is going to have forms, it's going to have fields, it's going to have views, it's going to have dashboards, it's going to have all these other business rules, all these different elements that make up how that particular entity functions within that particular application. And so that's what we look at when we start talking about designing these apps modules is not only what are the entities that are going to be a part of this app, but what are the dashboards and what are the sub-assets that are going to make up how that individual situation works. Now what's nice about that is because we have the ability to really build these from the ground up and really make these task orientated, I now have the ability to really focus my users only on things that they're going to do to perform the specific task that they have at hand. I don't have to spend a lot of time, trimming security roles and messing with different situations on a normal scenario. I can really target this based upon what I want to do. And I can use, to build on that, I can still use security roles to control who has access to what app. So within the context of the application, if I'm building one for sales functionality and I only want sales users to be able to see that functionality, I have the ability to just assign that to my sales people's security roles within the application, and then each user will now have a home screen that they can navigate to, and when they navigate to their home screen is going to show them each individual app that they have access to inside their Dynamics 365 implementation. So there's really several components that are going to make this process up. Obviously, the first one and first and foremost at the beginning part of it is going to be the site navigation. So how are they going to navigate through the different elements? So when they click on sales, what are the different areas that show up inside sales? Is settings going to be displayed where people can go in and make changes to that? If you're looking at it from a field service perspective, are we going to organize things based upon standard service and then field service? What dashboards are going to be associated with that? What business process flows? So obviously from a business process flow standpoint, you're going to have business process flows that are going to be very specifically targeted at different subsets of users and different subsets of record types. Those business process flows that are only applicable to what you want to do from this particular application can be added into the application as well. And same things with forms, views, and charts. So now you can really start, building these different forms and building these views to really target specific functionality inside the application and not have to worry that just because it's a system form or it's a system view that everybody's going to see it. Only the views and the items that people need to see based upon what they're trying to accomplish are really going to display and bridge across the individualized modular apps that you're working with. So when you start talking about how the apps work and when you start working with it, if you're not using the apps module, then if you think about it historically, there's one navigation configuration for everybody. So there's that one area that you have to really use security roles to define what people have access to within the application itself. And so the only real way that you can work through that is by using security roles. Whereas if you use the apps module or by using the new functionality, now we have the situation for each module to have its own configuration. And what the user is going to see is not only trimmed by their security and their security roles from that standpoint, but it's also trimmed by the different module components that are added. So if I'm only adding specific forms on the account entity, those are the only forms that they're going to see when they go into that particular app. The security is still the same. I mean, from a security role perspective, if you understand the core security role functionality inside Dynamics 365, that hasn't changed. That still controls what the users can do in the application. That still controls what records they can see inside the application. But on top of that now, we can trim down the individual components based upon associating them with specific apps inside the application. There's a lot of different ways by just bringing the apps module or using apps modules that you can access the individualized applications that you have access to. So one of the areas that you'll see is from your Dynamics home screen. So there will be a home.dynamics.com, which when you navigate to that, that's going to show you all of the different applications that you have access to. So in this case, I can see here that I have access to kind of the custom application that is all of the functionality, but then I also have access to a custom lead generation app that's been designed. The other option that we can go into is we go into settings. And when you go into settings, you have the capabilities to go into kind of your apps from there and work with the My Apps area that you have access to, and we'll show you that inside the application as well. You also have the capabilities from within the application as well as by URL. So let's just hop back into the app here real quick and we'll show you all the different accessing options that you have, and then we'll build on that from a functionality standpoint. So first and foremost, if I go up into where it says Dynamics 365 and I click on that, this is going to load me into kind of my apps area. So this is going to show me all the different apps that I have available to based upon what's been installed into my specific organization. Now the other option that I see in here is Home. And so this is going to take me to that home screen, which is that home.dynamics.com. So this is going to show me all the different apps that I would have access to based upon the environments that I'm working with. Now the other thing that you can see here is I have multiple tenants associated with this login that I have access to under the same Dynamics 365 organization subscription. So I actually have like a development environment, I have a production environment. This is why you're seeing some of these different elements showing up twice. This could always be trimmed based upon security situations, but obviously with being an administrator, I have access to everything. As I go into these individual options and I go into the specific environment that I want to work with, then it'll navigate me into the application. Once it navigates me into the application, now when I click on my option here, now I'm only going to see the modules that are associated with this particular organization. So I have my custom one for my development organization, I have my sales one for my sales organization, and then I have my customer service one, but all of these are being displayed underneath my development environment. Now what you can see is each one of these has different options. So from a customer service perspective, I really only have 3 areas that I can navigate to. I have sales, I have settings, and I have training. When I come down into my sales option and I click on sales, now you'll see that I have basically just my organized options for sales. I have marketing, I have settings, and I have training. But each one of these have been customized differently based upon the specific functionality that I require within the context of that application. Now the other option that I can do is I can go to settings, and then underneath the applications area, I can go to my apps. And then this is going to show me all of the different apps that I have access to and show me kind of the status of those apps based upon the organization that I'm currently logged into. And this is where I will now have the capabilities to be able to, create a new app from here if need be, edit some apps, and then do some of the different controlling options that are available as well. One of the major advantages to this is the fact that we have the ability to now start to lock these down a little bit and to actually start going in and defining what specific areas people can go in as part of these individualized apps. So for each app that you have access to, that you go in, if you have administrative permissions on that particular item, you can go in and you can click on Manage Roles. And this is actually going to open up kind of an access generation capabilities to determine what specific security roles inside that organization should have access to be able to use and work with these individualized app modules. So here's where I can go in and specify what that option is. Now the other thing that's nice is this is where I can also go in when I start managing the app, and I can also determine what specific URL suffix I want to use. So it's going to look at the organization that I'm associated with, and then it's going to go ahead and define and use this as the actual app module that will navigate it to that particular item. So each app has to have kind of a suffix URL that's appended to it at the end that'll define how you navigate to each one of those individual areas. Now the other thing that you can do is if you wanted to, you do have your default kind of app option that you can use for your organization scenario, and that's the one that really pops in as the Dynamics 365 Custom. If you don't want to call it Dynamics 365 Custom, if you want to call it something else or make it something else within the context of the application, you can do that. That has to be done through system settings. So you would actually have to go into Settings, Administrations, go in, show your default option, and then go ahead and just change the name of it if you want to. You also have the capabilities if you want to, if you don't want to use that default app, you also have the capabilities to go in and kind of hide that from that standpoint as well. So you can basically hide it from all roles, go into system settings, basically define that you don't want to use it, and then that'll hide it from all situations. Or you could go into site settings, just hide it for all specific roles, and then confirm that, and then it wouldn't show up for anybody that doesn't have access to it, which in that case would be everybody. So you do have several different options around how you want to handle that default app. Probably one of the first things that you would want to do though is really just rename it just to be safe. So I want to take you in here and we'll just walk through kind of these pieces here and show you all those different elements that kind of make up how this process works. So first, if I go into each one of these options and I click on Manage Roles, this is going to open up those individual sales roles or items that I'm working with. Now, specifically, if I was going to create my own option in here, this is where I could give it kind of my app URL suffix that I wanted to work with. Otherwise, I could go into here and I could specify what specific roles I want to give these items access to. Now, the sales option and the service option, those were kind of pre-configured when I chose to utilize those individual apps. So there are specific security roles here called Sales App Access and Service App Access. That's the other option that you could do, is you could create specific security roles that would then define what specific apps they have access to, and then you could use those to kind of manage what the options are. But remember that even though I'm managing options here, I'm just giving them access to the app. Their security role still has to give them access to accounts, contacts, opportunities, any of the individualized records that they're going to be using within the context of the application. So just by simply telling them that they can or cannot access the sales app, if I don't have access to accounts or I don't have the appropriate security permissions for accounts, I still can't work with accounts in that sales app. And there isn't a way to specify, that I have access to only accounts for the sales app. The only way that I can do that is by coordinating my appropriate security permissions inside the security role and then saying that this security role has access to the sales app. So it's still the traditional functionality as far as security goes within the application. You're just defining it on an individualized basis. Now, the other option that I can do is if I go into settings and I go into administration, I do have the capabilities in here underneath system settings to go ahead and define how I want to work with this information from within here as well. So this gives me some generalized customizations around the specific options that I want to do for these options around my welcome screen and my custom modules. And so if I go all the way down to the bottom, this is where I could rename this for whatever scenario I want to call this. So we're just going to call this training. And then if I wanted to not have anybody see it, then I could just switch this to no. But this at least gives me the capabilities to render this as my training app. Then once I kind of refresh my functionality, as I refresh my functionality, it'll then change that to my training app so I can see that inside my module. But again, this is a schema change, so just like anything, I would have to refresh that functionality for it to show up inside the application from that standpoint. But you can see there's a lot of little subtleties in here that I now have the capabilities to do to really start tailoring how these apps are going to be presented inside the application. When it comes time to actually design your application inside Dynamics 365, if you've played with the new Business Rule Designer or you played with the new Business Process Flow Designer, the app designer is going to look very similar in concept. Now, obviously, it'll be laid out a little bit differently in the fact that you're working with individualized applications, but from a conceptual standpoint, it's still going to have that same components properties aspect associated with it, where you'll look at the different items that you want to add into that situation, and then you'll be able to kind of work with items from there. So you can see within here that I have my sitemap, which every app has to have a sitemap associated with it, and the sitemap is going to define what specific areas, groupings, and sub areas we want to work with within the context of the application itself. You're also going to be able to see what specific dashboards you want to associate within the context of this app. So when people come in, if you want to make specific dashboards available, you can do that. Same with business process flows. So you're really going to see broken down into a couple of different scenarios. You're going to see the concept of what are called artifacts, which are really going to be the things that you're going to see at kind of a main level. So it's going to be the entities that you want to bring into this particular application. It's going to be the dashboards that you want to display inside this application. And then it's going to be the business process flows that will be directly utilized inside the custom app that you're working with. Now, from there, once you start bringing in specific entities as artifacts, then each one of those entities will have entity assets associated with it. This is going to be things like forms and views and charts that are going to further coordinate with how that application is going to be displayed inside. So let's go hop into the app designer and just kind of take a look at some of these different situations so you can see how they all play out. Before we create one, let's look at some of these existing ones so we can really get kind of a handle on how things are broken out. So let's just look at the sales module or even the customer service module first. So I'm going to click on my more options for the customer service module. I'm going to go ahead and click on open an app designer. And this is going to go ahead and open this up inside the app designer. So here's that breakdown of the individual situation. So I can see that I have a sitemap that is associated with the customer service module and that has been configured specifically for the customer service module. And we'll talk about how to open that up and work with that here in a couple of minutes. I can see that I have specific dashboards that have been added. So I could just by glancing at it, I can see that there's 5 dashboards associated with this particular element inside the item itself. Now when I click on that, it actually goes into my components over here on the side and it shows me all of the individualized dashboards that would be available for me to add to this particular module. I would also have the capabilities just to check or uncheck options if I wanted to based upon here. I do also have the capabilities if I wanted to create a specific dashboard inside here and then make it available. I'm still making a customization. If I create a new dashboard, I'm still creating a dashboard at an organization level. I'm just determining whether or not that dashboard should be available inside this particular module. Same with business process flows. If I hit back here and I look at business process flows, I can see that I have one business process flow associated with it. And by clicking on this particular option, I can see what specific business process flow is attached to this particular module. So this will be the only business process flow that would be defined within that scenario. And then I start scrolling through my individualized items. So here's all the entities that make up this particular module itself. So I can see that the account entities in here, articles, activities, contacts, entitlements, goals, goal metrics, knowledge base articles, products, and anything that would basically be associated with this from an entity perspective. And then I can define, based upon how I want to work with it, what specific forms, views, and items are actually shown up in here. Now, by default, with most of these modules, when you start thinking about, sales and service, pretty much all of the different entity assets make up what's taking place in here. So you're seeing all the individualized forms, you're seeing all the individualized views and charts. So pretty much everything that's associated with it does show up in here. But this is where you now would have the capabilities to determine what specific items you want to bring in as part of this option. Now, as you've gone through and you've created these individual components and these individual situations, you also can save this and then validate it. So the other thing that you'll have to remember as you're adding these specific pieces and components to it, you do need to, at some point in time, validate the solution or the app to make sure that everything that is required in order for it to work is there. If you don't validate it, you will run into situations potentially where things may not have published the way that you wanted to, or you may be missing a component or something similar to that. And we'll talk about that here in just a couple of seconds. Now, if it's time for you to go ahead and create your own, now you're going to go ahead and create your app. It's going to ask you what you want to call this, and so we'll just call this My App. It's going to give it a unique name, so it's going to use kind of your standard customization prefix functionality. So if you've changed your default publisher, it'll use kind of that default functionality. You can determine whether or not you want to use a specific icon default image for this if you want to, or you can determine other options. If you wanted to pick a specific option that you wanted to use, you could pick other icons that you would want to work with. But as you can see, these are really just web resources that have been uploaded into the application that you now would be able to use to constitute how you wanted to show them as part of your app. Once you've gone through and you've initiated the initial items that you want to go through, now you can go ahead and hit done. This will create kind of the new app within the application, and then it's going to bring you into the build process. And so this is where you're going to start building your individualized functionality to determine what specific capabilities you want to have within here. Now, the first thing that it's going to show you is that from a configuration element, the sitemap is not configured. And that's fine at this point because we haven't gone and talked about it yet, but we will talk about kind of configuring the sitemap as you're moving forward. Now you go into your different dashboard elements and I could now start picking and choosing what specific dashboard items I want to make up as part of this particular scenario. Now, the nice thing about it is as I add some of these different dashboards, it'll start to bring in entities that are associated with those dashboards automatically for me. So as I start bringing these items in, I can see that the case and the entitlement options started to come into that. If I were to go into my marketing dashboard and add some of my marketing capabilities or even some of my sales activity stuff, as I start bringing those items in, I can see that all the appropriate entities that are associated with those items would start to come into this element as I'm moving forward. If I wanted to, I could also come in here and just add a specific entity to this option. I could find the specific entity that I want to add, check the box for that particular entity, and then it will bring that option in from here. And then I can start kind of determining what specific options I want to use just by clicking on the individual forms and items in here accordingly. So you're really going to just start picking and choosing what specific items are going to make up how you want to navigate through this particular application. Now, as you're building these, there's going to be dependencies. So if you think about how Dynamics 365 just works in general, when you add specific components to a solution, so if you add a lookup menu to a solution and you don't have that entity referenced somewhere else in that solution, you're going to have issues within that scenario. Same thing with dependencies when you start talking about application dependencies and building stuff. You will have items that will be kind of required or items that you would kind of need to have. As you're building these different things, it'll tell you, okay, this item has a scenario that is talking to this particular entity. So you have a lookup that's looking at this particular entity. It doesn't necessarily tell you, you have to have this in order for this to work, or it's just good to have from a fluidity standpoint within that situation. So as you're going through, when you start going through, all of that information are retrieved kind of on demand. So when that application is run, it looks at the dependencies, determines what those situations are, and then does return those items or retrieve those items, even if they're not necessarily included in the module. So they have built some stuff in here to make it a little bit easier, so if you do forget something, it's not necessarily going to break your entire validation process or your entire application, but it is still important to note that there is still that dependency concept, and so it's a good idea to do some different validations, and it'll tell you what's missing, and then you can make the determination as to whether or not you really truly need to add it in there or not within that scenario. Again, just like anything, the more you add and the more you run your validation, the more it'll check for dependencies, and ultimately it will tell if you do it right, you could add everything back into the application. So don't let the fact that there might be a little bit of a dependency there dictate what exactly you're going to try to do within the app. Still use your best judgment as to what's going to be the best flow process for the users as they're consuming this information. The other situation, if you get validation errors, so when you go through and you're ready to push the information out, you can't publish it if you have validation errors. You might get warning errors within that situation. So if you get warning errors, it will still let you publish it with that because there isn't anything detrimental to what it is that you're trying to do within that scenario. As you saw when we were in the designer, if I didn't select anything, it just assumes that by default I want to include everything for that item. So everything is an all unless I physically go in and start checking individual situations that I want to work with within those items itself. The other thing is if I go in and I add items to a solution, it isn't necessarily going to add it into the module. So if I've gone into that module and I've said these are the 5 views that I want to have in my module, and then I go into the solution and I create a new view, I didn't initially say that I wanted that view in the module. So I still have to go into my app module and I have to add that view into that application module. If I have all selected, that's fine. Then any view that I add is just by nature going to come into that situation as you're going through within that item as well. And then the other thing is as you publish information or you do kind of a publish all, that includes all pending module and sitemap updates. So if you've gone in and you've made some modifications to modules and you've made some modifications to your sitemap, and then you do a publish all, if you haven't published those individual items on those app designers or in that sitemap, the publish all is going to do everything. Just like if you did a publish all inside the system, it's going to take all of your unpublished customizations and publish them. These are considered unpublished customizations. So you really want to be careful with that publish all, particularly if you're pushing out individual apps that maybe aren't necessarily ready for prime time, because within that process you could push stuff out without it being fully ready. And then the other situation, they do have options as far as save as and SDK support. That's not right now necessarily in there, but that's stuff that they're considering. So moving forward, we will start to see some additional scenarios with this. But right now, as it exists today, there's still a lot of powerful options around what you can do with the app designer. The other consideration, and as you saw a little bit when we went into the initial demo, another consideration that you have to really build in is each application module has to have a valid sitemap that defines where exactly you can go and what specific elements are available inside that option. Now, in the past, when you wanted to do sitemap modifications, that was a very manual process. You either had to export the sitemap XML or the XML out of the application in a solution, and then either edit the XML directly, or maybe open up like a third-party utility and then modify and create your different areas and sub-areas and groupings from there. Now, with the context of Dynamics 365, we have a full-blown sitemap designer that we have built into the application that we can now use within the context of our individual items. So that's the next area that we want to talk a little bit about, is what does this sitemap designer process look like when you're going through. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can actually access the sitemap, and we'll show you that as we go through. One of the first ones, if you want to edit just the default sitemap for your entire deployment, you can actually go into the default solution for your organization and you can hit edit. And when you go into edit, if you select the sitemap and hit edit, that'll open up kind of the sitemap designer and allow you to edit the individual sitemap from that standpoint as well. Or you can go into each individual application that you want to do and then kind of modify it from that standpoint as you're going through. Now, before we go in and start, modifying a few things, there's just a couple of different situations that you want to keep in mind. Now, the first thing, that each individual sitemap that you have from an application standpoint are separate from the default navigation. So the default navigation has its own kind of sitemap that defines how you're going through it. As you add individual application modules, each one of those application modules will have their own separate sitemap that you're working with it. When an entity is added to the sitemap, a dependency is now added to that application module. So if that entity was not necessarily in that application module before, it'll be in there now because there will be a dependency on that situation. And then when you publish the module, the sitemap changes also get published. So those are kind of the big things to remember. And it really behaves how you would expect it to behave. If you're going to bring something into the sitemap that's not in the application module, it wouldn't make sense that you would want to navigate to something that wouldn't necessarily be there, so that dependency is going to be established. And just like anything, if you're going to be publishing the application, the sitemap goes along with that particular application. So again, it would make sense that you would want the sitemap to be published at that exact same point when the application is published. So let's hop back into the app here a little bit and then walk through the sitemap editor and let you see how that process works. So again, before we go back in and actually go into a custom module or a custom application that we're creating, let's look at the customer service option. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up in App Designer, and I can see that there is a sitemap associated with the customer service module. When I click on the option for the sitemap configuration, now it shows me my individual items that are associated with this particular option. So now as I click on this item, I can see each of the individual areas just like I would see inside the application itself. So when I click on my different areas, I can see the items or the properties that make that up. So I can see the image files that are associated with it, I can see the ID in the sitemap, and I can also see whether or not I want to allow groups within that situation. And then again, if you've ever done any sitemap modifications in the past, this is also where I can go in and add additional titles and additional descriptions. So again, if I'm going to be working through this particular module or this particular application, and maybe I support multiple languages. So maybe I have a scenario where I support French and I support Spanish and German. I would, just like I would have to in the past, I would have to go in and add the additional language options for each item that I want to work with as part of that particular standpoint. So you would want to add your titles, your German descriptions for each area that you're going to work with subsequently within the application. Now, when I click on my individual groups, it's the same thing. I have the capabilities to go into my individual groups, and I can define if I want to use titles for those, what the ID is going to be around each one of those options. And then finally, when I click on my individual sub areas, this allows me to determine what specific type of item I want to work with, what specific entity it's going to be within this situation, and then what item I want to go through from there. So I can actually determine, am I going to link this to a web resource? Is this going to be linked to a URL? What specific URL am I going to point this to? Is this going into a specific dashboard within the application, or is this coming into a specific entity? So this is what really allows me to define how this process looks as people are navigating through these different elements as part of the sitemap. So there's a lot of what you would expect in here just from a normalized situation. As I scroll down, I can also get into situations where I have privileges. So if you remember, if you've ever done anything with sitemap stuff in the past, you have the ability to display information based upon a subset of privileges. So for example, if I only want somebody to look at the service calendar, if they have specific privileges, I could do that. Same thing with accounts. If I only want people to be able to go into the account record, if they have read access at an account level and maybe they have read access at a contact level, I can do that. You can specify your different privilege sets based upon multiple entities. And so this now gives you the capabilities to really kind of finite drive this information home based upon what it is that you want to do. So you want to make some kind of careful considerations in regards to how this information as a whole is really going to affect what it is that you're doing moving forward. The other thing you want to consider, or the final consideration you want to think about when you start talking about your app modules, is solutions. Because obviously we're making solution changes and we're making component changes to the application itself. And so if you have a solution that has different components and different items, you can create a solution that has one or more apps modules. So there is actually kind of an app module component now that you can add into solutions as part of the options that you're going through. So you definitely can have a solution that has multiple application modules in it based upon what your functionality would be. One thing to remember though is when you add a app solution, or when you add an app to a solution, the components are not automatically added. It doesn't make the assumption that just because this application has been added to the solution that it should add all of those different components. And that would make sense, because if you think about it, the app module itself might contain a bunch of out-of-the-box entities, and those out-of-the-box entities would already be in any environment that you're going to bring that option into. But what you certainly would want to do at the very least is probably go into the add requirements or add required components option, click on that particular scenario, and just make sure that if there are any real glaring dependencies, that those items get added into the situation that you're going through. And again, the other thing is that's kind of neat with these is if you're doing managed solutions, if you're an ISV and you're going to ship this as part of a managed solution, you can ship your apps as part of a managed solution, but there are no managed properties around the application module itself. So just like if you think about how managed properties typically work for forms and views and some of those standpoints, those don't apply to the apps modules. The app module can be there, but the individual properties or managed properties aren't going to be there. You're still going to manage and maintain who has access to those options through the traditional application module settings and items in there. Now that Dynamics 365 is becoming much more app centralized, whereas you have specific targeted functionality. You have sales-driven functionality, you have service-driven functionality. Even when you start getting into things like field service and project service automation, you have very targeted modules that specify a specific business requirement that you're looking at. With all that happening, it's just a natural progression that at some point in time, you're going to want to tailor the application to fit your specific business functionality. You have a specific business function that you want to create an app for, and you want to target that functionality specific to whatever that situation might be: lead generation, sales generation, maybe just processing returns or some other type of processing within the application. What's nice about the new application module designer is you have the ability to do that. You have the ability to really refine not only what the user sees in the context of what that specific desired functionality is, but who has access to it. So if certain people within your organization should not have the ability to use that particular app module, at an application level, you can prohibit, based upon their security role, who has access to go in there and do that. The other thing that's nice about the app module is it allows you to use the existing customization. So the things like entities that you create, reports, dashboards, views, anything that you might have to create to constitute delivering that functionality is already in the system. It's just a matter of you specifying what specific application inside the system you want it to use. And with that being said, you also have the ability to take these application modules that you create and leverage them as part of solutions. So I could add one or more multiple application modules to a solution that I want to use to distribute it off. Now, the thing to remember when you're adding them to solutions, though, is the components that are a part of that app module don't necessarily automatically get included. So you would have to go in and define, what specific components might have dependencies or what modules might have dependencies on specific components. And if you expect that they're not going to be in that environment, you would want to package them as part of the solution. It just gives you a much easier way to develop these very targeted, streamlined applications based upon specific desired functionality.